Hey everyone, welcome to the Iterative podcast. My name is Inez, and today I'm joined by Suken, a general partner at Iterative, an accelerator focused exclusively on Southeast Asia. Today, we'll be doing a deep dive on accelerators. Amongst many other things, we hope to demystify the process of applying to one, examine what accelerators are looking for, and explore how startups can maximize the value of an accelerator. Let's get started. To begin with, what is an accelerator and how do they work?
Yeah, and I think maybe there's like a couple different entities, and so we can kind of maybe use that to kind of compare and contrast. So I think there's angel investors and VCs. There's incubators, there's accelerators, and there's venture studios. And so maybe I'll just iterate through them. Angels and VCs are just investors, and so their primary value is money. So they invest, and then hopefully they're helpful when you need them, but they mainly kind of leave you alone. That kind of varies a little bit, but for the most part, venture studios are a group of people, and Brian and I thought about doing this too. It's a group of people who are very good at starting things, and so they get together as a group and they work on a bunch of different ideas, and the goal is to launch a new company, 3 new companies a year. And then when those companies get to a certain size, they bring in outside people to be like founders of those companies, and they run it out and they spin the company out. So it's a newer model that's come around maybe in the past couple of years, but it's like this founder for hire thing, which I don't know if it totally works, but some people have been successful with it. And then there's this incubator accelerator thing. So I'll spend a little bit more time here. I think of incubators as ideas that are kind of really early, and they're kind of incubate, and they're literally just okay, let's get this kind of started. So it's all in the names. It's incubators are about incubating ideas, and accelerators are about accelerating existing ideas. This gets blurred a bit. I mean, we've definitely invested in some companies where the idea was basically at the incubation stage. Accelerators, for the most part, though, are about accelerating an existing team and company to kind of their next stage. So for us, that's typically taking companies that are pre-seed. Maybe they haven't taken any investment. There's a team working on it. Maybe they have a couple users, a couple hundred users, something like that. And we try to help them get to that first round of funding, which is typically $1 or $2 million. And we try to grow their user base or product kind of significantly. So maybe those are the buckets. There's investors who are primarily money. There's venture studios who are trying to spin off their own companies. And then there's incubators, accelerators, which are trying to help founders accelerate their growth or grow their company.
In terms of access, right, how do the barriers to entry vary for these various institutions?
Yeah, so I guess typically it's a venture studio is kind of its self-contained thing, right? So they're starting companies themselves and whatever, and then they will invest and they'll introduce investors into it. And then incubators and accelerators tend to be kind of much earlier, and they're helping these companies kind of introduce to angels and investors. And so I guess maybe angels and investors are the end recipient of these types of companies. And then I think earlier on there's these. But if you're thinking about starting a company yourself, you're probably in the incubator accelerator range. Maybe you can skip to kind of angels, but venture studios are kind of out.
I mean, we may have touched upon this a little bit, but I'd like to ask you, why is an accelerator different from just receiving money?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple parts, right? So, if you were starting a company, right? Both give money. So we do 150,000 USD, and then investors will write kind of various checks. But we also have this 3-month program, and I think accelerators. Most famous one is Y Combinator, which we're kind of based off of. But there's lots of different models. So some are 6 months. So ours is a 3-month program. And you primarily want to join an accelerator, I think, for 2 reasons. One is that mentorship. So hopefully the people who run the accelerator are people who have started companies before. And so you need to believe they are people that are going to be able to help your company. If you don't think that they're able to help your company, you should not join that accelerator. But so I think one is mentorship. And maybe let me dig a little bit down on mentorship, because I think a lot of people say they're going to kind of mentor, but what does that actually mean? So for us in our program, for each of the companies, we assign them either Brian and I as kind of lead partners, and we're responsible for their well-being during the batch. I would say on average, I spend probably 5 to 7 hours during the batch per company a week. And most of that is actually helping the founders kind of develop. So maybe a non-obvious thing is that most startups are actually held back by the founders. And I think first-time founders are trying to kind of figure this out. And so a lot of the time that I spend during the batch is actually helping the founders develop so that they can kind of grow grow their startups. And that can be anything from like a safe space that we can talk about what they're worried about, and they can admit that they don't know how to do this. And by the way, all founders don't know how to do this. It's like a totally normal thing. It can be from teaching them kind of mental frameworks on like how to think about growth, how to think about their products. Like fundraising is kind of a big topic that we talk to people about, like how do you actually do that? So there's a lot of mental frameworks. And then we're just kind of trying to help them navigate the stage that they're in so they can kind of get to the next part. So there's a lot of this like mentorship thing that we do. And then the other part is the community. I think good accelerators should have strong communities. We think of our accelerators like going through that program is actually just orientation into the community. And I think this is especially true for Southeast Asia, where people don't know as many founders as like maybe the founders in Silicon Valley does. This is like accelerators are a really easy way to kind of plug into that network and meet a lot of other founders. So I would say it's maybe those two parts, is the mentorship of the community. If you're joining an accelerator primarily for the money, I would say don't, right? Like that's what investors are for. Like they will kind of give you the money. You don't have to kind of spend all this time kind of in the accelerator program. So if you're talking to accelerators primarily for money, you should probably just talk to investors. If you're talking to accelerators when you are fundraising, I actually think that can work. But a conversation I have a lot with startups is actually you should come talk to accelerators before you're going to like raise money, because we can help you get there, right? I think we're like very helpful in kind of helping you get to that next fundraise. So maybe there's a couple ways that we think about it.
Right. Granted, you don't have any experience otherwise, but how do you think this process of mentorship and cultivating a community has been impacted by virtue of it being moved online as opposed to being there in person?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess we started Iterative during the middle of COVID. So we haven't done this outside of that. But Iterative is really an extension of something Brian and I have been doing for like a long time before. I mean, we've been helping startups for a long time, right? So, I guess Brian and I have been in startups for maybe like 14 years or something. And so at least 10 of that, we've been helping companies on the side, and I advise companies and all of that. So I have some kind of like experience with that. There's some good things to it and there's some bad things to it. So maybe let me start with the good things. Since it's remote and everybody is more comfortable on these Zoom meetings, there is an increased surface layer area of like people that you can talk to. So, we had in the last two batches, we've had like, the co-founder of Product Hunt, co-founders of Airtable, like come and talk to the batch, and they're all in Silicon Valley. And I think if it was pre-pandemic, pre-Zoom thing, founders wouldn't have been able to kind of like hear from people like that. Or maybe they would, but it wouldn't have been as good and that kind of stuff. They're not coming out to Southeast Asia kind of for like a talk. So I think it's really opened up the number of people that we can kind of get involved and kind of like the mentors that come with that. So I think that's really positive. The other positive thing is I think people are much more willing to spend their time talking to startups because of the efficiency of Zoom. Like now, if somebody asks me if I want to like meet for coffee, I don't think I've taken a meeting of actual coffee in like months. And it's primarily because it's like, even if it's a 30-minute meeting, it takes me 20 minutes to get out there and it takes me 20 minutes to get back. And, there's all this stuff that kind of goes along. So at the end of the day, it's going to take me an hour and a half. And I think these Zoom meetings are so efficient that a lot of people can just like get in and out of them. And so I think people are more willing to share their time because of this efficiency. So these are all the good things. I think the negative part is it's still hard to build relationships. And I think especially kind of like social relationships online. There's a lot of people working on this, but I think a value of the batch is getting to know your other founders. And I think that's actually quite tough remotely. I'm excited to, when things hopefully kind of open up, I don't know if we'll ever go back, but I would love to have like an orientation that's in person so you can build some of those relationships early on as you go through the batch. But I think that's challenging for everybody that's like doing remote programs right now.
Wait, so Ken, what happened to the need to change your context once in a while? To leave your house, to have meetings outside?
It turns out maybe that stuff is overrated. No, okay. I mean, look, I think it's still important, but I think that maybe the positives of it are kind of like doing the kind of like overriding the like negative parts of it. But maybe the trick is personally you want to change your context, right? So maybe you don't use meetings as that, right? So like I go on walks every morning now, and I like sit outside a lot, and I think that's a better use of changing context than like I met Inez for coffee at whatever place.
Right. Gotcha. I mean, over the last two batches, Iterative has accepted startups from a wide range of industries and those which operate within vastly different contexts. And given this contextual specificity, how can accelerators help companies they themselves lack context in?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think a question that we get asked a lot. So I think of startups as there's a lot that's different. There's a lot that's the same. So I often think of startup problems as like there's like a general set of startup problems. All startups need to grow. All startups need to fundraise. They all need to hire. So it's a general set of problems. There's specialized problems where the specialized problems can be like, if you're a fintech company, you have to deal with regulation. That's a thing that you need to think about. That's special to your company that maybe like Instagram doesn't need to think about. It could be like country specific, right? So I don't know, starting a company in Indonesia is probably quite different from Singapore. Bangladesh is very different from Singapore. So there's kind of these like specialized versions, and there's a couple of vectors where make these kind of specialized. I think the general set of problems is pretty straightforward for us to help on, since we've kind of started a lot of companies. We know those problems really well, and they span kind of like globally everywhere. And I actually think that most founders, especially in the early stage, those are the problems that they're dealing with the most. Is actually that general set of problems, and they're the first ones you kind of hit immediately. So I think we can help with that a lot. It's kind of like the same everywhere. We think about it that way. The specialized set of problems we can help with if it's like industry specific, because we have quite a bit of knowledge in kind of like a lot of different industries. I think the one that people really think about the most is actually the country one. Right. So, just to be like very transparent and concrete, we invested in a travel company in Bangladesh called Go Zion. Brian and I have never been to Bangladesh. We don't know what Bangladesh is like. We don't know anything about Bangladesh. The way that we think about that relationship, and hopefully this is like accelerators, like I can kind of use our situation and it can kind of like extend out to accelerators. Hopefully this is not just like an ad for Iterative, but the founder is from Bangladesh. He is like Bangladeshi and he like lives in Bangladesh, right? So he has a lot of that. He has all the local context about Bangladesh. And so we are trying to arm him with how to think about startups and frameworks for how to think about stuff such that he can apply that local context and run his business. The other thing that we often do is we sometimes pull the local context out of him, right? So when we're talking to him about problems and we're debugging problems, we can talk about, here's how we think about it, what's happening here. Okay, does Bangladesh do something different here? We can kind of pull some of these things out and then apply that into the framework and then kind of like move. But, I think the best case scenario is we can work with that local founder who has that context and we can help him solve the problems. I think the worst case scenario is if we don't have context and the founder doesn't have context, we're screwed, right? Like nobody has any context, so like that doesn't work. And so we typically don't do those investments. So, if somebody was building a travel company in Singapore for Bangladesh and has never been to Bangladesh and we've never been to Bangladesh, none of us should probably be doing this. So we stay away from those.
Right. Now that we've covered how accelerators differentiate themselves from their counterpart and more. So could you elaborate on how startups can find the right accelerator for them? And to extend that question, what makes a good accelerator, even though that's completely dependent on the startup themselves?
Yeah, and look, this answer is going to be a little self-serving because like we run an accelerator, and like part of the reason that we started an accelerator was because we thought that there was a lot of like room for improvement in accelerators. So I apologize, this is going to be a little bit self-serving. Maybe let me start with, so Y Combinator is the most successful startup in the world. And they argue that they're actually the first, and they actually might be right. They've been around for about 17 years. What makes Y Combinator so special is it is previous founders teaching first-time founders or new founders, right? Sometimes there's people who are previous founders that join YC now anyway, but for the most part, it is multi-time founders teaching first-time founders. So if you look at all the partners in YC, they've all started companies before. Some of them very successful, some kind of like so-so, but they've had the experience. Why is that important? For people who are already founders in the audience, they already know this, but for everybody else, being a founder is a really unique experience. It's like unlike I haven't done all the jobs, so I can't say this unlike any other job, but it's probably unlike, most other jobs that most people have. And so unless you've been a founder, I think it's hard to really empathize with what that experience is like. And I think a lot of that actually comes down to just like the feelings of being a founder, which again is not often talked about, but in private conversations with founders, this is the stuff we end up talking about the most. Look, there's no other job where you pour yourself into something, you have some idea, and then you go talk to 70 strangers who are investors, and they also tell you your idea is dumb. There's like very few jobs like this. And at some point, you start wondering if maybe you're dumb for thinking this idea is good. And so this just happens all the time. And unless you've been through that yourself, it's hard to kind of empathize. And the thing that I always say is if it's hard to empathize, it's hard to help. And so I think it's really important to kind of like work with people who have done this before, and you can kind of like learn from them. And look, I think if you haven't been a founder before, there's still probably a lot of stuff that you can kind of like teach. But I think for some of these kind of like very kind of like experiential things, it's a little bit harder. And it's kind of like reading a book and like talking about those things as opposed to like living through those things and then being able to talk to it. So I think that's the thing that we wanted to kind of bring to Southeast Asia, is like this experience of having been founders and then kind of like teaching founders in Southeast Asia. So, again, very self-serving, but I often think about like work with accelerators that have, the partners have been founders before. And maybe the like larger branch of that is if you're considering accelerators where the partners have not been founders before, the overarching thing you want to think about is, are they going to be helpful to your company or not? You join an accelerator because you think the accelerator is going to be helpful to your company. If they're not going to be helpful, you shouldn't join an accelerator. And again, we talked this before. If you're joining an accelerator for the money, you should just get the money from angels and investors. And look, sometimes you join accelerators because you think they can help you raise money later on. And that's fine, right? You just need to be able to you need to be getting something else besides the money for the accelerators. So I think that's the biggest part for me. Maybe some other things that you can look at besides the partners is look at what other companies have gone through the accelerator, and do you want to be like one of those companies? So you can kind of look at these companies, you can look at their websites, you can see if they fundraise afterwards, like you can look at all of these things, and you want to look at like, be like, okay, do you want your company to be like one of these? So if the companies look really good, like they seem successful, the founders are kind of impressive, this is kind of the cohort people that you want to be around, be part of that accelerator. If you look at all the companies and you look at the founders specifically and you're like, I don't really like want to be like any of these companies, and I don't really want to like get to know these types of founders, it's kind of a red flag, right? I mean, that's basically what an accelerator is for, to go back to my community point. So I think looking at the portfolio companies and the founders who have gone through this before is really important. Something that we were surprised to see, it wasn't surprising after we heard that it was happening, but we were surprised to see at like how often it was happening. After our first batch of companies, we were recruiting the second batch and we were extending offers to companies. We found out that all of those companies, and before even they got offers, were like LinkedIn messaging and cold emailing all of the founders from the first batch and being like, is this legit? Is it worth it? Right? And being like, can they get on the phone and like talk about it? And I thought that was great. You should do this, right? You should do your homework, right? And like talk to the founders and be like, hey, is this like worth it? Is the program worth it? And like that kind of stuff. And if the founders don't think it is, like you probably shouldn't do it, right? But I thought that was like a great thing for like people to kind of like do their homework and kind of like find out. So I'd highly recommend doing that if you can. That's going to be like the best source of truth probably. And so we're seeing that now kind of like all our subsequent batches, they're like talking to the first couple of batches. So I think that's great. And then maybe this last part, which is like very capitalistic, but something to think about is like, one measure of whether this accelerator is going to help or not is, do you think they're going to increase the value of your company? They're going to invest, they're going to get some equity in the company, but you need to kind of believe that they're going to increase the value of it in kind of like whatever way possible. So it might be hard sometimes to think whether this accelerator is helpful. And so a very tangible way is like, do you think they're going to increase the value of your company? And are they going to do it for how much equity they're going to take? One more thing. Incentives. I think people don't think about incentives enough. There's a bunch of accelerators that don't take any equity. And I just have a hard time thinking they're going to help that much because they have no incentive to actually help you. That makes no sense. Like, so if you're looking at accelerators, look at the incentives. If they don't take any equity, it's hard pressed to believe they're going to really like work that hard. There are some accelerators that invest money over time. So they'll do a little bit at the beginning, a little bit in the middle, and a little bit at the end, and this kind of stuff. They are hedging their bets so that they give you a little bit of money so you'll participate. And if you do well, they'll put more money in. And then, if you do really well, they'll kind of put more money in back at the end. You're not going to be able to be as open with them as possible because there's like this test every period. This is part of the reason why we invest all of our money right up front, so that we are incentivized to help you as much as it goes, and we can create that safe space. So look at how these deals are structured, look at the incentives. Some programs charge a program fee, which is ridiculous to me. Inez, are you familiar with program fees?
But perhaps you could elaborate on it.
Okay. I never even heard about this until I got to Southeast Asia. This does not happen in the US. I've heard of program fees where an accelerator will invest, I don't know, let's say 100,000, 150,000, and they charge you like a 60,000 program fee. So what really irks me about this is startups are like short on cash. And basically investing 100,000 in a company and then taking 60K back means that they are getting $100,000 worth of equity, but actually net, they only paid 40K for it because they charge you this program fee. And I just think that that is a really tough structure to kind of like be in. So please look at the paperwork. Please look at incentives. And I think incentives will kind of tell you everything. But basically, if you want to know what is going to motivate people or how people think about the transaction, just look at their incentives and that'll tell you everything.
So essentially do your homework and do research on the accelerators and people who have been involved with them. Yeah, I mean, that's what this is also applicable to not just accelerators, but also just finding a job, right? Like I, of course, did research on you guys before,
of course,
prior to joining, right?
Yeah. Hey, what did you do?
So I looked at your website.
Great.
Just Googled your name.
Good.
Checked out your LinkedIn profile.
Yeah.
I found watched your podcasts, see interviews you've done, and also reached out to people I saw who were mutuals on LinkedIn, which is what you mentioned, right?
Yeah. Do all of those things, right?
Do all of it.
I think one thing that is like I feel like sometimes I have catchphrases and my friends make fun of me. Something I find myself saying all the time is do the math. Like sit down, any decision you have, like do the math. I'm like surprised by how many people like make this big decisions, like whether you should join an accelerator and like don't do the math or like don't do the homework. Like do the math, make sure you do it all. It's really important.
I guess
and do it on us. Like if you're going to apply to us, do your homework.
Sure.
Like, do everything Ines did, right? Like email people, talk to us, look us up, like listen. Like, I mean, if you're listening to this, there's probably some percentage of people who are listening to this podcast who are thinking about being part of an accelerator. Like listen to our stuff. Like, if you think that, in our podcast, we say a bunch of stuff that like is not that helpful, like probably don't join the accelerator, right? But if it's helpful, then like, okay, maybe you should like join. So get a sense.
As a final question, extending question, would you recommend for startups to be, one, more intentional with the way they do the research, spend their time on doing the research and applying to accelerators, or should they apply to as many as possible in the hopes of securing interviews with some places? Or is there a fine balance between those two options?
I mean, I'm not partial to the like spray and pray one, because I just think that there is a lot of accelerators who are maybe not going to be as helpful. And so I think it's important to really kind of do your homework. I wouldn't apply to just like one, but maybe I wouldn't apply to like 20. I would make a short list, right? And this is the approach that we take when we like are thinking about raising money from investors too. Figure out what are the like 3 to 5 best accelerators that you can kind of like find. Do your homework to kind of figure out like who those are and then apply to those. I tend to think with accelerators, and I hope we're in this bucket, but probably the top 3 to 5 accelerators are hopefully kind of like very, very helpful. And then the remaining accelerators outside of that are probably not. It's not probably a linear, like progression is probably quite exponential. So I think do your homework to kind of like find out what those are. But yeah, I would definitely do that.
Okay, then when should startups apply to an accelerator?
I think all accelerators maybe have a different take on this, right? So, I know the like Antlers and EFs of the world, they just are looking for good people. So even before they have co-founders, they'll help you find a co-founder, they'll help you with ideas. And so, I think every accelerator is different. So, I think there's definitely an accelerator for all of the stages. We tend to invest in companies. We've invested in companies that do, millions in revenue. We've done some where it's like, last batch, it was like 2 kids that just graduated from school, right? So and they kind of had an idea, so they weren't very far. So I think my advice, if I was a founder, again, is just, if the accelerator is good, just apply. I have this like saying in my life, which is like, make someone else say no. Like don't pre-say no yourself. And I think about this, like when you're looking for jobs too, I don't know how many times somebody is like, oh, I would really love this job, but like, I don't know if I would get it. And so they like, don't apply. And that's like you saying no to the job yourself. And it's like, no, make the other person say no, right? And I think of accelerators in the same way. If there's an accelerator program that you think could be beneficial to you at that moment, you should apply. Like get them to say no. I think the other part with it too is it's a really good hack to get feedback on your idea. So I try to write feedback for everybody that applies and, doesn't get in. And so if you apply to our accelerator, like, I will probably give you some feedback on that idea, and you can decide to take it or not take the feedback, but at least you're getting some feedback on that idea. I don't know of any accelerator where if you apply once, you cannot apply again. So honestly, just like keep applying, right? Like every step, just like keep applying. Maybe something I'll share. I don't know if this is public, but it's, it's not anything we're trying to hide. We have a special status in our like internal kind of like company tracking thing that is following. So these are companies that we're like, oh, they're a little bit early, but like there's something promising there. We want to like follow up with them and keep track of them. So we mark these companies in, right? And sometimes we're very open with them. We're like, hey, I don't know if you're like the right stage for us now, but like, hey, can you apply to the next batch, or I'll email you before the next batch, and like we can catch up and see whether it's good. So if the program is good, apply to it as early as you think is useful to kind of you, and make them say no. Is my take here.
And perhaps moving on to the stage that requires the most demystifying is, how does the application process actually work? What are accelerators looking for? And how can startups increase their chances of successfully getting accepted into an accelerator?
So I guess I only really know 2 accelerators, like internally. So I know ours obviously very kind of internally, so I'm happy to share what that process is. I know YC's process a little bit because I have a bunch of friends who are partners and our second company went through it. So maybe let me kind of like talk about both of those. Our process is somebody, you put in an application online, we ask a bunch of questions, and it's actually, to completely demystify, I look at all the applications. I hand look at all the applications, and I try to make a somewhat quick decision about whether this application is something that we should kind of spend more time on, as in one of our venture partners should like reach out to this company and kind of like dig in, or whether there's like, I don't know, something that turns me off to it kind of immediately. And maybe I can come back to that around like, what are the things that turns me off initially? So let's say it goes through, we have a venture partner take a phone call with the company. Typically these are like 30, 45-minute calls, and they're trying to do 2 things. One, get a better understanding of what the company is doing, but actually subversive is too strong a word. The thing we're actually really testing for is, what are the founders like? Like, are they convincing? Do they seem formidable? Formidable is a word we throw around a lot, like internally. Our questions are actually just ways to see if the founders are formidable and they think structurally and all this stuff. So that's what those first calls are primarily about. Our venture partners may be a little bit different from a lot of other firms. Our venture partners are often existing operators. So they're often founders that run their own companies that we know. So they take these calls on our behalf. If the venture partner then fills out an online feedback form, I mean, that's obviously private. I should go through what those feedback forms are sometimes, but we look at that feedback form has problem. So, how big of a problem is this? Has a scoring for solution, which is how much better is the solution than the existing solution? So is it incrementally better? Is it a step function better? Are the founders kind of formidable? So we look at some of these kind of buckets and they score it on that. And then they make a final recommendation that's 1 to 5. If the venture partner is positive about a company, then Brian or I will get on a call with the company and we kind of do like a second check. And we do the same process, 30 minutes, 40-minute phone call. We fill out this feedback form. It's okay. We have these like 2 data points. If both of the data points are positive, we have this final interview, which, as you kind of know, you sat on a couple of these now. Before the final interview, somebody will write a memo that kind of digs into the company and tries to understand the space and kind of like validate a lot of things the founders are saying. And then the final interview is about a 90-minute long interview, which really is more conversation than interview. Maybe we should like change the like name of it, but the parts are, people do introductions, they pitch the company very quickly so that everybody has context, they give updates. Then we spend the bulk of the time digging into some of the like risk areas that we have identified, written in the memo, and just like talk about that. And then at the very end, we kind of agree on this 3-month plan. The purpose of that final interview is the Q&A session is, we want to identify risk, but more than anything else, we want to see if the founders have identified similar risk and how they feel about them. How do they kind of come about answers to that? And obviously the best case scenario is if we identify a bunch of risk and it's clear the founders have also identified these risks and they have good answers around how they're like going to de-risk those things and like they can talk intelligently about it. That obviously is like makes us kind of feel good about making investment. And then the 3-month plan is do we align on where we think this company should go in the time that we work together? So we don't want to have somebody come as part of the batch and we think they should be doing a very different thing, or we're going to have a hard time kind of working together. And then we just make a decision after that final interview together, and then we move forward after that. So our process is these like 2 calls and then this investment memo and the final interview. YC's one is quite different. You apply online and then there's a 10-minute interview and then they make a decision off of that. Reason they do this is because they invest in so many companies, they look at so many companies, it's just kind of a scale thing. And so, there's this kind of like quite fast and kind of like straightforward. It's because they make so many investments.
How can startups prepare?
Yeah, maybe this is kind of like, what do we kind of like look for too, right? I think a couple things. Maybe there's a couple buckets here. It's like, know your kind of like metrics. If you have metrics already, like know what they are, right? I think one of the things that we look for in companies is, are they like data driven? And data driven is a word that gets thrown around a lot, but are they able to kind of like look at their metrics and kind of come up with insights, and then can they do something about it, and can they make it happen? So when we talk to companies and they like can't tell me how many users signed up last week or a month ago, it makes me think they don't look at those numbers very much, right? And if they don't look at their numbers, that means that they're not trying to generate these insights, which means they're not doing kind of stuff. So I think very, very easy hack is just like know your numbers and know them off the top of your head. Maybe another part too is like have concrete plans on what you think you want to do going forward. I don't actually care as much like whether your plan is like right or wrong, because honestly, I don't even know. But have like a plan of what you think is going to happen. So we tend to think about plans in like a short-term period, like, okay, what are like the next couple of things that you're going to try? But we also like to have companies, maybe this is like extra credit, they have some sort of like master plan. So I talk about master plans a lot with companies. And I think master plans are like long-term, and they typically are 3 steps. And I think the best like structure of this I've seen is Elon Musk he wrote a master plan for Tesla when they first started, and he just like published it in a blog post, and he spent the next 10 years kind of working on it. The ordering really matters. I often think that the like telltale sign, one of the telltale signs of like a good plan is like, if you can rearrange the steps in your plan and it doesn't matter, it's probably not that good of a plan. The best plans are like, you have to do this so that you can do this. And then if you do that, then you can do this. And if you do that, that's really valuable. And I often think for startups, like if you can articulate your plan for how you're going to get from where you are now to something, an end goal like that, you're like way, way ahead of everybody else. It's tough to be able to do that, I think, as a first-time founder, but maybe as an aspirational thing, something to think about. One more part to the end of the, like, what can startups do for the accelerators? Get started. Like, get users and get traction. Like, validate your idea. Sometimes I look at ideas and they haven't started validating or whatever. And, sometimes, look, I agree with their idea and I'm like, okay, maybe it's kind of interesting. But every startup that has an idea and has traction is like automatically kind of like better to me, because they've like proven some of it. And it's better for 2 reasons. One, there's no amount of theorizing that beats actual kind of like metrics and traction. So like get started, try to get some of those. And 2, it shows me that the founders know how to get started and like are predisposed to action. So I forget where I read this, but I just really like this quote, and I think it applies to startups a lot. Action creates information. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. Oftentimes, I feel like I talk to founders and they have like spent so much time thinking about their problem, they get kind of mixed up. It's like they sat in the ivory tower and they're like, okay, the world is going to be like this, and then this is going to happen. And they like build this whole like model of like how the world is going to be. And that is like a tough place to be. Sometimes you just like, you build this house of cards where you made these assumptions and the assumption isn't right. And then, everything kind of breaks down. And when you are building that ivory tower and that house of cards, you're just doing a lot of deduction. There's no new information. You're just like thinking about it. And I think this action creates information thing is really important, because you want to be able to get more information about what you're doing, and you need to like take action in order to create that information. So just as like advice to kind of like startups to get started, like I think about that quite a lot. So I think getting started and having some of that initial kind of like traction is really helpful. This is a topic for another podcast, but there's so many things you can do to get some of that initial validation that doesn't require coding anything. It doesn't require very much money, probably just like a lot of hustle. So, that's a topic for another podcast, but I think about that quite a bit.
Right. Then upon successful acceptance, what actually happens in an accelerator? And how should startups and founders succeed in an accelerator or maximize the value of being in one? So
I think accelerators are all quite different, and the programs are quite different. So they should list what happens in their program on their website. So obviously like spend time as part of your diligence trying to understand what those are. Our program is modeled after YC. It's the one that we kind of participated in, so we understand it the most. So maybe I'll kind of like talk about ours. A couple things happen. One is that it's a 12-week program. Ours has been kind of like 14 weeks, but there's a couple things that we do in the batch. So in the past, we've done, every company is assigned a lead partner, which is either Brian or I, or actually next batch we have a visiting partner that we haven't announced yet, but we have a visiting partner who's going to help companies. But you're assigned a partner. That partner is responsible for your company's well-being throughout the batch. And at the very beginning, you sit down and you say, okay, where do I want to be in 3 months? And that's typically some North Star metric. So Grab is not applying to our accelerator, but if it was Grab, it'd be like number of rides. Or Airbnb, it'd be number of nights stayed. So whatever your North Star metric is, where are you now and where are you at some point in the future? Where do you want to be in 3 months? And so we basically plot out every week where you need to be in order to get there. And we help level set. So oftentimes I have conversations with startups where they're like, we've been growing 10% month over month. And I'm like, cool. Is that fast or slow? And they're like, I don't know. It seems fast, right? I mean, I don't know. I don't know how fast DBS grew last year, but much slower than that, right? They maybe grow a couple percentage a year. And I often tell startups you're not DBS. And it turns out 10% month over month is not that fast actually. So our target, which is the same, we're just taking this for YC, is it's 5 to 7% every week. So if you grow 7% every week for a year, you're going to 33x. And if you grow 5% every week for a year, you're going to 12.6x. And so for early stage startups, you should be able to kind of if you've really figured out how to grow and you have product market fit and stuff, you should be able to grow at these kinds of speeds. Not to say that you need to be growing at that speed in order to kind of apply and get into the accelerator. I think internally, that is the speed at which we want companies in the program to grow during the time in the program, and we help them do that. So a lot of the partner meetings is you're meeting with your partner every week, and they're helping you do that. Maybe the best way to think about how these conversations go is it's a little bit founder therapy, which we've been talking about, and the empathy part. And then a bit of it is debugging. So, I think Brian and I are engineers, and so we think about it in a kind of engineering way. If your idea is as good as you think it is, and people want it as much as you think people should want it, and you should think these things because you're starting a company around it, it should grow quickly, right? Now, the reality is that no startups kind of grow that quickly right off the bat. So there's something wrong with how it's manifested in the moment, such that because there needs to be some reason for why it's not growing. Now, it could be that your idea isn't as big as you think it isn't as good, blah, 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 but that's not the place to start. So we think about debugging your product or your company so that we can figure out how to unlock that growth. And often this can be, what are the stuff you're working on? How are you going about working on those things? Are you kind of thinking about it in the right ways? And so we work with them on this. So a lot of the program is working with partners and kind of thinking about those things. And then we have a couple other events, I guess, that we work here. One is we have founders who are more experienced typically and probably reasonably successful kind of come into the batch and talk to the batch. The whole point of this is the way that media likes to portray founders and kind of companies and startups is always they only talk about the wildly successful ones, and they always make it seem like an overnight success. And having spent some time in the Valley and getting to know some of the founders who are of this wild successes, it's never actually that case. It's just how the media wants to do it. And so I think for first time founders, they see these stories and then they compare it to their existing experience and they're like, it's so different. And so we want these founders to kind of come and talk to our batch and talk about what the early days were like and some of the challenges they went through. And it's off the record. It's only for people in the batch. And so they can talk very honestly about it. So some of the guests we've had are, I think I talked about it earlier, Ryan Hoover from Product Time, the Airtable co-founders have been our college friends of mine. We've had the CEO of Foursquare. We've had Moses, who's the founder of Zendit. They come in and talk about these early days, and they talk about kind of the stuff that we would talk about if we all got together in a private setting, and they just kind of do this there. So we do that. We also do what we've been calling small groups, which are we split the companies into 2 groups, and each of the founders kind of give updates on what is going on with their companies, how fast they are growing, what's working, what's not working. And the event is designed so that you learn from other founders in your group. And then 2 of the companies will bring a problem that they deep dive. So, if you're doing marketing for the first time, you can be like, hey, I'm starting to do marketing. I don't know what I'm doing. How have you guys done marketing? And then everybody in the group will try to help you out. And then the final thing we do is this fundraising bootcamp, which is fundraising is so much harder for first-time founders than kind of like second or third-time founders for a whole host of reasons. But first-time founders don't know investors, and investors are notoriously hard to reach unless you have some sort of warm introduction, and you kind of don't know what they're interested in. And so you're like pitching an idea, but you don't know what they care about. And these are both things that we can help out with since we've been there before. So, we know a bunch of investors. Our last demo day had like 250 investors, so we make introductions. We also know what investors are looking for. We've raised, probably over $100 million. And so we've kind of figured out what they care about. We've also now do a bunch of investments ourselves. And so we help companies figure out like what their story is. And so it's quite personalized. We work with companies on their pitches. And then we have this demo day where we introduce. So I think these are kind of the blocks for part of our program. But I think all accelerators are a little bit different.
All right. So after going through the program, what happens after the end?
Yeah. So, I think I said this before, but we just think about our program as orientation into the community. And, community is a word that's like thrown around a lot. So let me get kind of more specific there. We have Slack and kind of forums where our community kind of exists. And so they still participate in it. So if you have a question for anybody else in the community, which is previous batches, your batch, you can ask questions. And so we still get quite a bit of kind of engagement with people kind of asking questions around that. There's a fair bit of it that is just also kind of like friendly. I think people post like funny startup stuff that they run across. And so I think part of that is just like, you want to be part of this community that like you can talk to people about. So I think there's that piece. We also help like negotiate further rounds of funding. So, we have lots of, private Slack messages with founders, even after they've gone through the program of like, this investor is saying this, what do I do? Or, hey, have you guys talked to this investor? Actually, this is something that happens a lot in our like Slack between the cohorts is I'm talking to investor X. Does anybody have any experience with them? And somebody will chime in and be like, I talked to them, or they're an investor of mine. Here's what I think, right? And I think there's this like power structure asymmetry because all the VCs talk to each other about all the companies, but like none of the companies don't really talk to each other about all the VCs. And so we want to do some of that. So there's a lot of this kind of like sharing of just like knowledge and experience with stuff. So yeah, we help negotiate with kind of like deals. I've interviewed candidates for kind of senior roles for companies that, have gone through the accelerator before. I have a call 3 days from now with a company who's kind of going through kind of like a key decision point. So they want somebody to like talk through what it is. And we work together during the batch. So I have like quite a bit of context. And so we're going to talk about it. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff we help with. It's kind of quite wide ranging, but I think for us, think about it as like, once you're part of the community, how does the community and that group of founders help you as you're kind of moving on? And then how does the partners kind of like help with that? And we also think about it as, we let founders as part of the community, not the company. So if you join and you're a part of our program, hopefully the company does well. But even if it like doesn't and you end up working on something else, you're part of our community forever, right? So if you've gone through the program before, you're always going to be part of the program.
Yeah, so that's the word that we've gone back to quite a bit, right? Creating a community, especially for Iterative itself, a community within the Southeast Asian region. I guess to end off this session, I would like to ask you, what gaps do you identify in the existing accelerator scene? And how else can the scene expand and improve in the future?
Yeah, I think, this goes back to some of the things I was talking about before, where I think we need more founders like helping and supporting other founders. And, that can be founders, currently operating founders and first-time founders helping each other, which we're trying to address with the community. And then I think, second and third-time founders helping those first-time founders kind of like working that way. So I think we're trying to tackle it from both of those. So to us, that's like the biggest, I think, opportunity is for us to help in that way. My larger thesis of like why we even, want to get involved with this is I think that the ecosystem is at this like really strong inflection point if we can just get this founder development to help. This is something that I said a lot to all of the investors in our fund, but there's so much opportunity in Southeast Asia. So there's a ton of opportunity in Southeast Asia. There's lots of capital. So there's a lot of money floating around Southeast Asia, and they want to invest in startups. The thing that is holding back the region, I think, is actually founder development. And I say founder development, not founders, because I think there are plenty of very good, like super strong, talented people in the region. look, I'm from the region originally, and I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley. I can tell you right now, the people in Southeast Asia are just as smart as anybody in Silicon Valley. There's no magic. There's no magic formula. There's nothing in the water. They're just as smart. And I'd actually argue that people from Southeast Asia are a little bit more gritty than people in Silicon Valley. And it's probably an interesting conversation about why that's the case. But I think Southeast Asians are quite gritty. And look, Southeast Asians are quite entrepreneurial. Maybe not in the ways that are like in vogue right now, but like if you think about the region, this whole place has been entrepreneurial, right? Like think of all the like businesses that are getting started and the old school industries and people starting countries, and like it's very entrepreneurial. It just hasn't been entrepreneurial in this like tech way first, right? And I think primarily because that knowledge hasn't been cycled back through the community, and we need to like create an ecosystem that like really develops founders in the way that I saw it in kind of Silicon Valley. And the thing that I open all of our demo days with is when you're a first time founder in Silicon Valley, you are like literally starting from like level 2, because there's all these founders that came before you and they're like telling you all the stuff to like not do. So, I guess there's the science term of like, you're standing on the like shoulders of giants. That's like absolutely true in Silicon Valley. And I feel like it's less so here. So hopefully we can help with that. But I think the biggest opportunity is this like founder development part. And I think that best happens between founders kind of helping each other.
Great. So do you have any final parting tips or thoughts regarding accelerators?
Do your homework. Do the math, do your homework, ask around, get feedback, I think is the biggest thing. So I guess if I'm summarizing it, it's do your homework, ask around for whether people are like past people have gone through the program, look at their incentives to see like how their deal is structured, and look at who's involved with it. And, maybe one tip for people is accelerators love to put lots of people who are involved with it as advisors. And I'm guessing that they're probably not that involved day to day. Find out who you're actually going to be working with the most, and then get a sense of whether you think they're going to be helpful to you or not. I give this advice when people are interviewing for jobs, but it should be as much an interview. You're interviewing them as they are interviewing you. And so like, take that to heart and be direct with them. Like ask them like, how are you going to help my company? Right. And it's like, they should have good answers to that. And if they don't, then, I think start digging in more.
100%. So again, thank you so much for your insights. And hopefully we have accomplished what we set out to do in demystifying and providing a primer on accelerators. Thanks everyone for listening, and see you next time.